Hey everyone, welcome to Unique Ways with Thomas Gerard, an audio podcast. We have a notable guest on today. He's had a 50 plus year romance with human aspects of technology, interaction design, telepresence, multimodal adaptive designs, access, and the nature of innovation. Morphing from musician to designer slash researcher, he has practiced his craft at the University of Toronto, Xerox PARC, Alias Research, SGI, and Microsoft Research. His awards include 4 honorary doctorates, co-recipient of the Academy Award for Scientific and Technical Achievement, ACM SIGCHI Lifetime Achievement Award, and Fellow of the ACM. In December 2023, he was appointed an Officer of the Order of Canada. Writer, speaker, and consultant, he is also an Adjunct Professor, University of Toronto, and Distinguished Professor of Industrial Design, TU Eindhoven. He is currently largely occupied curating his collection of over 900 artifacts documenting the history of interactive technologies. Outside his work, he has a passion for his family, books, and the outdoors. Please join me in welcoming Bill Buxton. Welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Ready for 20 questions?
Kind of. We'll see.
Okay, question 1. Tell me a little bit more about yourself. What do you do?
Too much to summarize in a sentence, but on the other hand, the things that concern me involve many different dimensions, that some of which I do myself and some of which I do with others. So it's some ways for any problem. I'm a curator, an orchestrator, as well as a designer in terms of what's the right process, who are the right people, what are the right skills, and with the ultimate goal of sort of saying, how do we make technologies serve society in the large better, and to how to avoid having technologies, maybe even supposedly smart technologies, make us stupid. And I think that's a risk that we deal with. The problems with technology go way back to the Industrial Revolution and even before. And so it's about what the impacts are in social, cultural, political, economic. And I think for people in our profession, given the impact technology is having on our society and culture worldwide, we need as many people advocating for the humane use of technology as possible, and not just the humane use. The abuse of the world is partially technology based, no matter how well intentioned it much of the time. But that's a long answer. And I still didn't answer the question, but it says why I do what I do.
Great. And just a quick note for the audience, if you guys are interested in a related episode, check out our recent episode with Don Norman. Question 2, what's a key piece of knowledge that makes you different?
So I kind of question the premise of the question. There's, unless you go to such a generality, a broad generality, that it's not that helpful. The flaw in that question is kind of like, what's your favorite technology, or what's the next big thing? There's no single thing or single point of view which is going to bring us to where we need to go. The problems are far too complex. I guess so that's why I'm not sort of saying in terms of I'm trying to do this or that, or this device or that device, or this application or this service. Rather, this objectified notion of what we do and even what we make or making obscures the fact that the next big thing isn't a thing. It's a change in the relationship amongst all of the things that exist in the environment, and the environment in terms of your physical local environment, but also your social cultural environment. And that includes people. It includes our methodologies. We have to remember that technology doesn't mean a thing. It's anything that's a structured or organized. That technology encompasses political structures, how we vote. Those are all technologies. And so, and they're all integrated and they all interact. And so it's, the challenge is, how do you think about it? Because what I just said, it just means the problem space expands to a ridiculous degree. And then, so the question is, how can we, having taken the broad view, how do we reduce our day-to-day activities to addressing things that can still make progress despite the complexity, and learn by appropriate process what works, what doesn't, and just test our hypotheses so that we can move on and make progress, albeit slowly. The good news about this is that things aren't moving quickly. At least no single thing is moving quickly. And that's the fear that everybody says, oh, technology is moving so fast, maybe collectively, but what we forget is that we mistake a bunch of things moving slowly with the technology is moving fast collectively, but the speed is due to the volume of slow things that are changing, as opposed to any one technology moving quickly. And in making that distinction, which is sort of like the distinction between voltage and amperage, we realize that, oh, it's a bunch of slow things. So whatever's coming, the roots are already there, and they've been there for at least 30 or 40 years. And therefore, if you know how to be a prospector, which maybe that's what I do, I'm a prospector, but then also I'm a miner, then I'm a refiner, but is to see what's going, and then you can actually see the rate of progress and look at the relationships, not of just the slow moving thing, but the other slow moving things, and what happens when they reach certain points where they can come together and aggregate in a way that brings some new insight and some new capability, but it's based on things that have been evolving for quite a long time. And I'd say that if you wanted to see even how I think, there's a journalist I admire really a lot named Brian Merchant, and he has a book on the short term. He wrote a really good book called The One Device, where he deconstructs the iPhone and talks about every single component that made the iPhone possible and shows how they relate, but also where they came from. And you see the long nose there. But he's got a more recent book called Blood in the Machine, which is basically comparing the impact of technology through the Industrial Revolution, and not just in a local sense, but in global economics with what's going on now. And if we actually understand the history and realize we can mine that to gain insights, when we do studies and we do build things, we can formulate much better hypotheses which have some existing foundation, because it's not all new, and then test them and therefore be far better grounded and do get more for less work. Because other people's work, and especially failures, are actually the greatest design tool, because if we can learn from what's happening, then that's the cheapest, most valuable education you can get for where someone else pays a tuition. And I'd argue that in a lot of levels. But the point is that the act of designing has to go it's at the front end of that where we make our biggest mistakes. We make assumptions too early. We don't do the research. We don't rationalize. We tend not to rationalize or cut short the rationalization of why we chose this versus that, and we tend not to work in multiples. And we tend, for example, to assume that, for example, 3D printers are a super thing to help us prototype, but we don't realize that eBay is a much better way to get prototypes, because if everything's already been done in one form or another, it's there for on eBay, ready-made at product quality for $100, and therefore you can get multiples that way. Which echoes, by the way, Duchamp and his ready-mades, and how you think about that from the art.
Great. So
too vague.
Great. So you kind of hinted at number 3, but the question is, why this, of all things, why do you do what you do?
Because I guess because of maybe the way I was brought up. Because my background was one of my primary backgrounds and my basic, my university degree. And I started playing music professionally when I was 14 and played music at least for 20 years professionally. And my undergraduate degrees in music composition and theory. And I'd argue that musicians have a longer history of expressing powerful creative ideas through a technological intermediary than any other profession in the world. And therefore, for what I do in terms of the digital world, that background in performance and understanding the design and actually the aesthetics of a musical instruments is one of the best training that you can do, because it's all about performance and how can a well-designed instrument amplify the human capabilities, and by the way, instead of replacing them. And I don't need a better record player. I want a better instrument that's worthy of practice, and where the instrument itself shows incredible respect for the multiple hours I've spent learning to play it, but they also motivate me to. I'll say the same thing about my bicycle. So the taking that as the ground, the reference point, I see technology. I'll say it this way. I believe that in the last 50 years, digital technologies have had more impact at every level, at the individual, at the social, cultural, political, and economic levels. They've had more impact on our culture than music, cinema, art, dance, architecture, painting, whatever you want to do from the fine arts. They've had the cultural arts, shall we say, what we normally think of cultural arts. The technology has had more impact on our society than all of those put together. And I recognize that from having spent the time struggling as a musician, but also from the perspective of having a deep background in digital. And I think if you take the values and what you can learn from the arts and these instruments of technology that are directly intended to be cultural, we have to bring the same aesthetics and the same values to the digital technologies. And we don't. And the thing that I would use as an informal proof of that concept is simply go to any newspaper of record and read the book reviews, read the theater reviews, read the film reviews, read the art reviews. But let's take book reviews. So we're both Canadian. So we have Margaret Atwood. And this is my whole example I use, is that if we reviewed Margaret Atwood's latest book, the way that we review some new technology let's say a new laptop or something like that, the review would read as follows. It's got a cover. It really protects the pages really well. And the two covers for the front and back are connected by the spine. And it's really neat because it joins them together and it's hinged, but also there's a mechanism where all the pages are fit within, don't fall out, so you can turn them. And the really neat thing is that there's print in it, but there's a high luminance contrast between the color of the ink and the color of the paper that makes it reading. And by the way, they're in, let's say, a 10 or 12 point font. But even cooler than that is there's all the search algorithms and methods and heuristics within it, because it's got page numbers, the sentences are broken down by punctuation. They're into paragraphs. And there's even chapter numbers, and there's an index and a table of contents. And all of this works together in an integrated package. It's portable. It's got an infinite battery life if it was built, especially the ones before 1900, before we put acid in paper. And it's fantastic. Oh, and by the way, there's a story. Now, that's how we review technology. And at no point, if you reviewed the book, you would never get into the arts page and the culture page by reviewing a book with that type of approach. Because you cannot talk about film, cinema, art, dance, or anything, any of these new creative arts, without placing them in a social, cultural, political context, because the story is just there largely as a metaphor or as a parable to actually make some type of statement, an ethical statement that reflects our society and helps people learn. So yes, you're entertained, but by that entertainment, which is the draw, it's part of the reward and the discovery, but it's also part of what's going on. And I would argue that's true even at all different kinds of literature. And I'd say the same thing's true with most music and art and architecture and so on. They're all this way to help shape us, but they're dwarfed in terms of the impact on our culture by this technology that we never, so the most powerful technology influencing those things, for the most part, is not grounded in that ethic and that mindset of how we approach it and how we think about it, how we discuss it. And that's why so many people start to back away from it, because they say, I can't see myself or my values reflected in it. Yes, you can give turn-by-turn instructions, but if you have Uber drivers driving around taking turn-by-turn instructions, and the AI is absolutely brilliant, the speech recognition perhaps is brilliant, they pretend that there's never any mistakes, and so on and so forth. The fact is that if you take the technology away, even though they've been through that city center a million times, they have no idea where they are. It makes them stupid. They park their brain. Same thing if you're using GPSs on Everest and a storm comes or your battery runs out, you're toast. In the Falklands War, a British ship was hit by an Exocet missile. It took out the electrical system. Nobody knew how to navigate celestially. It had to sit there as a sitting duck to be escorted back to the UK. And it's these types of things where we don't think about these things in a larger context of usage and what's the longer lifespan. And I'd argue that in some sense, that's the transformation and the types of attitude I would encourage all of us to adopt and be able to chew on that while we can still walk. It's like the analogy being to walk and chew gum at the same time. It doesn't mean you have to solve all those problems, but you at least have to be aware that those problems are there. Otherwise, you get something like, oh, we'll just fix it. We'll getting as many active users as we can to bump up our share price when we go public. And by the way, we'll, if something goes wrong, we'll just fix it. And we've seen what happened there with in the past in terms of Cambridge Analytica and so on and so forth. No, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So maybe you better think about those things. You better take it seriously. And then if the industry can, then the rest of society can. And they have shown that. And it's not the tech companies largely that are the final barrier really to that. But I would also argue that as consumers, we should maybe think about these things when we make purchases as well. and have that be a guiding thing, not just the price and not how many MIPS it has.
Great. Perfect. Okay. Some people struggle with number 4. The question is, what does your future look like?
I'm 75. I have 5, soon to be 6 grandchildren. I have this huge collection that I'm trying to curate. My mind is still working. I'm still active, but I'm not stepping back from, or not carrying us, walking away from things, but my future is largely being far more careful with how I allocate my time, because I want to stay healthy. I want to participate with my grandchildren growing up in a way I probably didn't with my own children, and but I also I don't want to walk away and not be available to consult or mentor or whatever designers or the field I've been working in my whole life. I'm not going to walk away from that. But I think my role in that is going to be far more judiciously placed, and even doing something like what I'm doing right now. This helps people think about this stuff. Then it's an hour well spent.
Great. Okay. Number 5, we say is unique to this show. The question is, let's talk about location. How does the notion of place play into what you do?
Yeah. There's a guy who's a colleague and just a brilliant person in our field named Mark Weiser, with whom I worked at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center. He was the director of the computer science lab. And what he is best known for is an essay he wrote in Scientific American called The Computer for the 21st Century. And in it, he defined the concepts and the principles underlying what he termed ubiquitous computing, so or UbiComp. And the notion of ubiquitous computing is that technology is kind of everywhere, and yet it's transparent. It's integrated into the ecosystem. And when I say, how can it be everywhere and transparent? Well, my crude example would be if you walk into somebody's house and the dining room tables in the dining room and the toilets in the bathroom, then you're not going to notice either. They'll just be there and they'll just go about your business and conversation. You're not going to stop and talk about it unless it's such a beautiful table, or if you happen to notice that it's a gilded gold toilet, which purportedly is in Donald Trump's bathroom. Those would maybe cause some, but that's the point is, if you switch the toilet into the living room and the table into the bathroom, you're going to notice it because they're out of place. And in sociology, there's a term for this around location, and it's called what's the moral order. And so we have this concept of within this particular point and where you are right now, there's a certain protocol. So I will we know the difference between, so we're going to McDonald's as is some posh restaurant. We're going to dress differently. We're going to dress in a way that's appropriate for the location and the function. If I'm going to court, if I'm going to church, if I'm going to a baseball game, if I'm going sailing or cycling. So place is really important. Now, here's the deal. Everything that Mark wrote about, I agree with, except for one thing. He used the wrong word. Ubiquitous has this notion, ubiquity means everything's everywhere. And it kind of, if you went to the extreme, it's everything everywhere all the time for everybody, and it remains transparent. Well, I think there's a conflict there. He used the wrong word. And I went to the dictionary trying to talk about when I'm thinking about place and look up what in the Oxford English Dictionary is this the specific meaning and definition of ubiquity. But on the way, I stumbled across by complete accident for a different word I'd never heard of called ubiety, U-B-I-E-T-Y. And ubiety has a very different meaning. It both have to do with place, where things are. But ubiquity means everywhere. Ubiety means no, in this specific place. And so ubiety would say the right thing in the right place at the right time for the right person, the right task, as opposed to everything everywhere all the time for everybody and everything. I'm stretching those to the extreme, which doesn't make sense, but it has to, that bifurcation is simply to accentuate the contrast between the two. The minute you start thinking about place as a fundamental component in design, you get something new. Now, part of this is already there. The way we interact with our computer, our phone, when we're driving our car is if you are using eyes on and fingers on to operate your phone, you should lose your driver's license because otherwise you might kill somebody, some little kid on the street. When you're in the car, the interaction language is mouth on and ears on primarily. And there is a 100% change in the interaction language when we're driving our car and operating our phone than there is when we're not in the car and when the action is fingers on and eyes on the touchscreen device. That was a really good example of ubiety, where the function matches the place and context. Now, everything we do in life is a compound task. The nature of skill acquisition and learning is just taking a bunch of elemental things and putting them together and joining them, or actually moving and coupling them, a phrase, adding it larger and larger, is how we build up chunks of meaning or semantics. So the point is this: we should all do backflips when we get out of the car in the middle of a phone conversation, pick up the handset, close the car, and continue the conversation, and then and maybe actually go and search to find things while we're talking with our fingers. The reason we should do backflips is there was just 100% change in interaction language and a 90% change in the technology that was managing that call locally. Oh, and by the way, the whole way when you're driving down the highway, that you're being handed off from cell tower to cell tower to cell tower. And so therefore, if you're not near a cell tower, none of that works. Because, and that's again, a function of place. If there's no cell coverage, you're toast, unless you've got a satellite phone. Now, all of this says that we have to think about things in their place, recognize that everything you do is a compound task. Each of those tasks may have a different place and or set of technologies required for them. And as we move from one phase of the task to the other, whatever that task may be, the technology has to morph in the same way that the phone does all the time. And it's so natural that none of us notice it. We don't think about it. Now, we can come back and think about this in terms of so-called large language models that are driving AI right now. And this is about place as well. So, look, the thing is that large language models can't handle even elementary linguistic utterances in one context, at least, which I will give, which I think is a very significant one, and it has to do with place. The first linguistic utterance a human ever makes is at about 9 months of age. And what they do is they point. And with my grandchildren, I'm monitoring that, but that's been known for years. And that notion of place indicating location in order to communicate, that is absolutely a linguistic utterance. It is simply not a vocal or a verbal utterance. And as you go along, they become more compound, where you use two hands and other gestures to enhance the vocabulary, let's say around 13 or 14 months, to pick me up, I want this, and so on. The dynamic gestures. No speech. Speech comes later. And then you start to couple these. But we notice that every computer out there today has a pointing device, it has a microphone, it has a speaker, it has a display. And very few of them can let you point and say, hey, what's that? Much less, hey, make this bigger like this and show it while you're speaking and move it and use manual, whether it's a mouse, a keyboard, or touch screen, coupled with the voice to be able to chunk together the multi-dimensional, multimodal, different modalities in order to perform a complex compound task. Now, if you go back to 1979, and for all of your listeners, please do this. Go to YouTube and look up Put That There. It's a video made by Chris Schmont and Eric Haltine. And the work was done 79 to 81 at MIT at the media, at what became the Media Lab, the Architecture Machine Group. And watch what they're doing. This is before the Macintosh. And every piece of hardware in that video was over the counter. They went out and bought it. Nick Negroponte had a very large budget from DARPA, and they set them up, but they bought it. They just put it together and demonstrated things that none of us, or very few of us, can do today with our modern technologies, despite over 1 billion-fold increase in computational power available for 1 billionth of the price kind of thing. And say, how is it that with these so-called large language models, which are not engineered to integrate these multimodal things at all, and therefore it seems to me, and I might be wrong, that there's a huge amount of refactoring that's going to happen because they're not taking account of this. Why can't we do that today? Why isn't it there every day? Because the tools are there. And so let's come back to place to make sure I'm not losing the thread. Pointing, a didactic gesture, is all about place. Where we have things and how they behave when I move from here to there is all about place and location. And we also have to be, place means not just any single place, but the transitions from place to place to place in every dimension of place that we can think of. And if we don't take those things into account when we're designing systems, they are going to be limited, and there's going to be these speed bumps that inhibit the flow of the things that humans do. We are analog devices, humans. We move in continuous ways and flow like music. And our technologies don't do that because things don't work together. They don't work cooperatively. And so the AI that I'm seeing today is clever. It's neat. I respect the people who do it. I think it's, in terms of what they do, it surprises me. But it is narrow, and I believe it's going to stall like every other generation, every other time when we've had these great big waves of breakthroughs in AI that stall. Another one, big hot one, it stalls because they're not taking account the big picture from my perspective and my observation of where the industry is going right now. And again, I might be wrong. But if you're not questioning this and checking out for it, then you might not want to invest because you better just do your homework, whether you're jumping into that field or if you want to make a difference in that field, you might want to take a different perspective than the sort of the race of the lemmings, all trying to do the same thing and be first and fastest, as opposed to thinking differently, which tends to be the way that most breakaways and new innovative companies get ahead, not by chasing the leader and doing the same thing, trying to do it better.
Great. So number 6, if you had to start from the beginning, what advice would you give your former younger self?
Well, first, don't go to the same university from undergraduate through your PhD. Expose yourself to different teachers. So every time you change the degree, probably go to a different, find a different mentor. I would say that you have to make sure that you pursue other passions that are outside of what you're specializing in, no matter what that is, so that you have breadth as well as depth. Literacy and breadth, depth in your specialty. But I guess the thing that first time I was asked that question, my answer was this: always be bad at something you love. The thing is, when you fall in love, whether it's with a person or whether it's with music or whether it's with a sport or stamp collecting or literature or poetry, whatever, you're a beginner. And it's that initial flow when you're in that state of passion for something, which you can do along with something else, which is your single thread. You have to always be falling in love with something, because that keeps you in a state of being a learner, of struggling with something new. For me, it's been things like mountain biking, skiing, 3-day eventing on horses. I'd never been on a horse before in my life until I was 40 years old. And I decided I wanted to go to the Olympics. And it seems like an idiotic, stupid thing to do, but I just followed that, and I worked really hard. And I actually got on the talent squad for the national team within 10 years. The point is this, that I didn't go to the Olympics, but through that, I was learning, and understanding what it meant, because some 16-year-old or 12-year-old girl is telling me how incompetent I was, and here's how to fix it. You learn from anybody, and you realize that it's learning about how to learn. And when you do that amongst different things as you go along, and you develop that, and then you realize, oh, this is how the people who use the things that I make in my expertise are feeling when they try to use the things that I made, where I didn't take that learning into account. And there's nothing I have done outside of my discipline. Let's say the discipline is UX design or human impact on technologies. There's nothing I've done outside of that formal discipline that hasn't informed it. I've been able to draw on that. My list of examples is huge. So here's the deal. Not only does it keep you learning all the time, I would challenge anybody who calls themselves an experienced designer. Ask yourself, what is the repertoire and the breadth of experience that you have curated throughout your life that would help inform your practice of experience design? And if you have spent your whole time in this narrow area about graphic user interfaces or things like that, then your answer to the question from the patron saint of experience design is going to be far too narrow to help you get where you need to go. And that, by the way, that patron saint is Jimi Hendrix, who asked the fundamental question, are you experienced? And the quality of a user experience designer is individually, but also in terms of your design team and your colleagues and the other people who are in the food chain of whatever project you're trying to do, is the collective experience the best it can possibly be to inform the decisions you're working on. And since nobody can know everything, there's no such thing as a Renaissance man or woman. There never was. Otherwise, why did the Medici why did Rembrandt or Donatello need the Medici to fund them? They should have done their own banking. They're after all, they're Renaissance men and women. No, they're not. They were really, really good. They're brilliant. You need to have a Renaissance team, but every one of that Renaissance team has to have this broad breadth, because with that comes an overlap, which comes common ground and common understanding, but also mutual respect. And nobody's the smartest person in the world. Nobody's the smartest person at the table or in the room. It's a collective team sport. And if you are really narrow, no matter how deep you are, you're not going to be a very good player in that type of environment. And that you can't sacrifice depth, because these are really hairy problems. So you have to really, really work hard on the depth. But that by definition means you have to be narrow to leave room to have a breadth of to lay out the common ground, so you can communicate, respect, and understand the need, who you need, why you need them, and how you communicate with them, and so that you can actually get through the job at hand. And that's just I would say, from a perspective of anybody who's an employer, whether you're in HR or I don't care what your discipline is, I would say the following. I'd say the last person anybody should hire is the person they're most qualified to hire, because the person you're most qualified to hire is the person who's just like you, where you're expert. You've already got one. You've got you. So the real challenge is knowing what you can't do and what you're bad at, and then make sure you fill those gaps. And then they sort of say, now your question is, in terms of hiring, is who do I find who to ask to find out how good this person is, what to test that person's qualifications. So if I don't know how to measure the competence in a field outside of my own, but I need them. I need partners, and I need that sort of social system around me as well. And I'd say that the biggest challenges, especially in large organizations, is how do you manage breaking out of these deep, narrow silos of expertise that all go their own way, and they get so far along the path that when you realize, oops, we could have done this or that, because there was none of that mutual reinforcement and division of labor and cross-pollination from the very beginning. And it has to start before you even draw one line on paper from sketching or spend $1.
Great, perfect. So number 7, what's a day in your life like?
It's not random, but there's very few patterns. I guess the best I could say is I tend to work quietly on my own without interruption in the mornings, and I tend to prefer to go, whether that's in a recording studio or composing music back in the old days, or writing, and I tend to work better in groups, having refreshed and come up that way in the afternoons. But these days, since I've rewired, my days are far more flexible. So I tend to try and be disciplined about exercise, getting outside, sleeping, eating well, and stuff like that. But I guess maybe the other job description that I didn't mention was I'm a juggler, and I try to keep a number of balls in the air at once, and sometimes I drop them. Often I do, and too often. And I'm still practicing to get better, and often I take on too much, which is and therefore I still pull all-nighters, I guess, as a consequence, as a penalty for that, which isn't healthy, but necessary. But it's something that if you're not willing to do that, even in your 60s or 70s, from time to time, I guess if it's your own choice and it's because you're so enthusiastic about it, that's kind of neat that you've still got that enthusiasm. If it's because of poor management, it's probably a character flaw. And maybe the way to tell the difference is that if you do that, do you also have in your schedule plans for recovery time so that you do still have a balance and you don't get just manic? That's something I would like to have the skills to have taught myself probably 50 years ago. I'm learning that part better at this age, which is later than it would have been it would have been more useful to know that earlier. I knew it. I just intellectually, I just didn't know it viscerally. And by the way, having said that, I just want to say that when I talk about experience, it's really important. We need to experience things viscerally, actually hold and move them and stuff. Design and what guessing and sort of reading about experience just doesn't cut it. And that's why we need artifacts and so on around us. That's why I have such a large collection of devices, so that I can actually, because anything I'm thinking about, I can find an example somewhere where somebody's built something that can inform that. And therefore, you need to be a collector. Not a hoarder, a collector.
Great. Okay. Number 8 is around lifelong learning. It's a popular topic. How do you stay up to date?
By choosing your topics well, choosing your questions well. If it's obvious what you need to learn, it's probably not the thing you should be looking at, because that means there's somebody else who already is really good at that. I tend to rather look at stay up to date by improving my understanding of, let's say, some of the core principles that I can reduce in terms of what and where I think I can bring value and how I can bring insights and creativity and compelling arguments for and against things that I'm encountering and how to behave. So I think I read far less stuff about current trends in technology than many people might. And yet, and that's largely because I believe things move slowly, and that the latest new thing is not a fad, but it's not long-standing. And so I'm going to look at other places where other people have had the same class of problems. So I read a lot of history. I haven't read fiction I used to devour fiction as an undergraduate and in early graduate school, but I have a huge library and I read a lot. And everything I read, I'm always thinking, oh, what does that mean I recognize that. How's that parallel? And it brings me insights. And I learn more about computer science or my field than I from reading about navigation, for example, in the days of sail and leading up to Hamilton's clock and going forward, and so on and so forth, and exploration and how do people map make and how do they make sense? How do they communicate? And by going to other cultures and not just reading a book about, what's the different gestures you use in this place. No, go spending time in different countries and learning different languages those are all things, if you're trying to think in a global sense about how to design. Learning Figma, it's a great program. It's really neat, but my time is not well spent becoming an expert in Figma. It's far better spent in saying what would I use Figma for, and what doesn't it do well, and where are the gaps, and how do I know those things, rather than getting good at that tool. I can just hire somebody to do that, and there's lots of people there as part of their career path. And I think that anything that when you're writing code for tools and even these AI systems, because they're pattern recognition systems, they're going to do the best jobs at making it easier to do the way things have always been done. The same way that GUI builders meant that everybody thought interaction design was how to make better graphical user interfaces, and never thought that maybe there's another ways to do things, or another better way to do different types of tasks than that. We're gradually getting out of that, but and by the way, in saying that, I could be accused of contradicting myself, because earlier I said, just base yourself on history and stand on the shoulders of giants and learn from that, and so that you can make people move forward more easily based on building on previous knowledge, both from the design perspective and manufacturing, but also the user's perspective. And then I just said, well, no, we want to find out very different paradigms, but those aren't contradictory, because often you will find the roots of new ways of thinking and innovation buried within things that are already there. I'll give you one simple example that I think will illustrate this. There's a guy, Don Hopkins, who wrote a paper on pie menus. He's a really bright guy. One of my students, Gord Hertenbach, did a thesis around marking menus, these radial menus. And the principal thing about these things is they are just a pop-up menu, like any pop-up menu that was on a Mac or the Xerox Star. And the only difference, besides the graphical picture, is that instead of making a selection by how far you go in linear distance up and down, say in a pop-up menu, or across the menu bar left and right, instead of making your choice by where you travel to and release the mouse button, you simply do it by the direction you go. And you sort of say, okay, it's just direction versus distance. Well, hang on. Without using your eyes, you cannot make a selection. We have no fine motor control to be able to do judgments of. You can't control where you're going to land. You can't hit a target linearly by distance without looking, at least not ballistically. You can ballistically go in the 8 points of the compass. And therefore, you can have pop-up menus that have 8 selections, which can be hierarchic, by the way, that are just pop-up menus. And they illustrate what the answer, just like a regular pop-up menu. They cue you to the direction, but every time you make a selection, you're training yourself to actually do the gesture. And you delay the pop-up by about 1/3 of a second, so that you'll get to the point where you realize, oh, I did the gesture before the thing even popped up. And all of a sudden, you made a transition smoothly using existing skills, existing metaphors, to a gestural interface that's 10 times faster than selections that you can do eyes-free in many cases, depending, and it can be localized. But it's just a pop-up menu, but it looks nothing like a graphical user interface. Oh, and by the way, you can integrate them into a graphical user interface at the same time to make the transition. And so this is what I would call is radical evolution. The way to design is design things in a way where the thing feels familiar. You can build on familiar metaphors. At least you can make best efforts. This isn't going to do for everything all the time for everybody, but it's a really robust way that you should be searching for. We all should be searching for. This is how I approach it, to do that. But it's, and say, it's just like this thing you already know how to do. And there's just this one little difference, but when you actually cross the threshold of using that little difference, all of a sudden it takes you into a complete new world. And this is what I call as radical evolution. It's a small incremental evolutionary step, but it's at a tipping point, if it's well designed, that takes you into a whole new mindset that is immediately understandable and usable and integrates into your conceptual model, but then gives rise to a whole other set of hopes and expectations, which then you can start to move to fulfill. And one of the things about making change and managing change as a designer is, how do you bring people to make them as comfortable as possible to just cross the threshold and find this new place where the threshold is just like going through any other door, except it just then where you land is this whole new magical place. And then all of these techniques, from the gestures and so on, if we want to talk about current day, they can move with touch, they can move in VR, they can move in AR, you can work in 2D and 3D. There's different, and I'm not just talking about radial menus, but there's techniques all around us for which metaphors can work, that where we can bring people along by emphasizing skill transfer as opposed to skill acquisition from new. That's learning. Learning's a power function. Skill transfer is just recognition. Oh, I recognize that. Okay, bang, I can do it. And understanding the basic psychology. Now, where do you draw these things from? Well, these single stroke shorthand like graffiti and so on and so forth, which made the Palm Pilot really happy, and which actually led, in my case, towards where we were working on these gestural things, actually was discovered and first used by a slave of Cicero in 63 AD, and was used to record the minutes of the Roman Senate. That's where graffiti came from. Jeff Hawkins doesn't, or certainly didn't understand that. He just reinvented the wheel. But anybody, if he had gone to look at a book in writing systems, he would have found it. There was no research to be done other than go to a book on a topic, as opposed to spend your time inventing something that you think is brand new and trying to, and you know. So these are the things you do: reading, going breadth of things which are informed, and trusting your curiosity. If it seems unrelated to what you're doing, what you're supposed to be doing, do it anyhow, because there's a connection there you just may not recognize. And for me, that's always been the case. Maybe a couple exceptions, but not many.
Great, okay. 9 is around tools. Can you talk about digital versus analog tools you use?
Yeah, well, I could answer that with a bad pun, but I'd say snapping my fingers, that's a digital tool. Those are my digits. I don't make a distinction. I think that, okay, I'll ask you a question. What made the iPhone special? Right? What was its distinguishing feature that made it cause basically Microsoft's and everybody else's mobile phone businesses basically crater? What was it?
It's an implementation of a vision.
I don't understand. Can you be more specific? I want that in the interaction, because you did what you said was ocular only. I want it has to be bi-directional in terms of conversation on how you interact with it, because that's what we're doing.
Can you ask the question again?
What was the thing that made the iPhone so special? What was the attribute? What was the thing? And by the way, anybody listen to this, start thinking about your own answer and write it down so that you can't lie to yourself afterwards that, oh yeah, I was going to say that.
Well, how about ubiquity?
No, but what made it ubiquitous? It was because it got such a rapid adoption because of what I'm talking about. That actually is why becoming ubiquitous and growing so fast is why it got the market share. What drove that?
That's unknowable.
Oh, I think it's very noble.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, because if
What do
you
you
look at
Yeah.
okay, let's take a look here. If you look at an iPhone, it had icons. Microsoft's smartphones had icons. It had a touchscreen. Microsoft's did. It was smoother and things like that. It was prettier and so on and so forth. It had apps. You do email and so on and so forth. So first of all, there was in one way you could say there's no one thing. And for anyone who wants to deconstruct this, I mentioned Brian Merchant before. I highly encourage anyone who wants to understand the full thing about there's no single feature of at the detail level that makes anything work. It's a perfect storm. And Brian Merchant's book, The One Device, deconstructs the iPhone into every single new component, not everyone, but the full body, from the glass to the touchscreens and the lithium batteries and the processor and so on and so forth, to say all these things contributed. But I'll tell you what my answer is. And the reason I'm asking this is you could sort of say, why am I talking about this? Because you asked me a question, digital or analog. Here's because this is germane to precisely that question. To me, my answer would be the iPhone was the first digital appliance broadly available that had an analog interface. Everything else was poke, switch, bang, bang. The iPhone, you stroked it, you squeezed it, you caressed it. Things moved. If you moved things, they squished. If you threw them, they bounced. They had all these analog features, as opposed to screen pop. The worst thing you can do is to have one screen disappear and another one come in, as opposed to float them in and out so you can actually see the transition, so you can acquire that. It takes longer, but it's faster to perceive. It was brilliantly designed in terms of the transitions and the animations, and the fact that and they got the sense right for the touch. So it was using the testing of what pressure it took and the fingers. They did their ergonomics really well, but they actually tailor it to be in a way, the difference between an amateur violin and a beautiful violin. It was finely tuned, but the main characteristic was it flowed. It had this animation, and the others who can disagree with me or that have different opinions, and I'd suspect that none of us are right. And therefore, when we have these types of questions, we want to enumerate them, collectively give their opinions, and then look at them. Because if you ask that kind of question before you start trying to build an iPhone competitor, the depth of variations you get from asking those questions, because I think most people wouldn't give the answer I gave. But again, doesn't mean I'm right. But those are the times of things that we go up against. But I would argue that the reason you don't see and jump up and down when you walk out of your car and the whole UI in your phone is because what you're coming from, whether you're coming from walking around and getting into the car or vice versa in the middle of a call, that it's certainly got to do what can the interface in one context at one place morph to smoothly morph and with a smooth transition, seamless analog in an analog way to the other context and vice versa. So you've got to take both contexts into account to make sure you can make that flow. You have to design the technologies to accomplish that flow, which still is pretty rudimentary. We're going to look back in 20 years and even in 5 years and say, how do we manage with these crude things we have today? But let's just think back and think we're making progress. But the world is analog, and there's very few things we need to be digital from the user's perspective. It doesn't matter. And as we know from electronic musical instruments and sampling theory, that you just that there's a blur where one morphs into the other in terms of action and how things flow. But if we talk about behavior, we talk about flow, the tools should flow, and the technology behind them shouldn't matter. I mean, the only reason you should know how the plumbing is in your house is when it doesn't work and you got a flooded floor or something like that. Does the toilet flush? Do you get hot water? Those are the things that from the end user's perspective that you expect. And it's rare that knowing the technology for the end user is important. Because then you're just thinking, this is the cool thing because it's a cool technology, as opposed to, wow, look what it just enabled me to do. Mm-hmm. Nobody asks, by the way, that when you're going down the freeway with your cell phone and you're being headed off from cell tower to cell tower, how does that happen? It's unbelievable. You've got separate computers, separate antennas, and there's just a seamless handoff all the way down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour. But you can't walk down the hallway with your phone with a Bluetooth where your phone, where it's driving a Bluetooth speaker in one room and have it follow you into the next room. There's no handoff. The model for how to manage networks to get continuity of moving from place to place in a building without disruption of having to repair and all that sort of stuff doesn't exist in our homes in any scalable sense. But it does in our cars going down the highway. Mm-hmm. How's that? Because one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing, because the people who do cell phones don't do this. And how do you know when to transfer completely over the next tower and leave the ones from 100 miles behind? They're no longer in the game. There's this, and this again comes back to place. It has flow from place to place. Then think of what are the dimensions of place and location that are important for the tasks we're doing. And it might be from doing line art to then coloring and that transition. How do you do that? How do you back up? These are not common things that we talk about in interaction design. We're spending all our time saying, how do we make this icon better, or how do we move these things around? It's basically putting new lipstick on the pig. The fundamental operations and how we do, and the speed bumps tend they've got makeup on them. It's smoother, but there's not that much change. I used to say, and it's still almost true, that if Rip Van Winkle went to sleep having used a Macintosh in 1984 and woke up today, he'd still recognize and kind of be able to work today's computers. Now, in some ways, that's a good thing. But I would say that that's at least at one level abstraction, a conversation that maybe design teams should have with each other, amongst themselves, or with themselves. What might have been different? What were other paths? What have we left behind? Because we were all of our tools, graphic user interface builders, GUI builders, and if you're using writing Python programs using ChatGPT or any of the new AI stuff, you're going to get variations on what already exists because you're copying patterns. And that's questionable what new things will be invented, new patterns are invented without human intervention or different training models and rethinking that. We need to step out of our comfort zone to find examples which are hidden in plain view to inform where we go and how we get there. And I think the status quo of how we teach design and how we tend to practice and how it's integrated into corporations, large and small, needs a lot of work that I don't see present.
Great. Okay. Halfway, number 10, life-work balance, work-life balance. How do you deal with it?
I think we already talked about that, but it's difficult for me to answer that question because in one sense, I never worked a day in my life. What I do in terms of what I have been compensated for whatever reason, is something which I care about, I think is important, and that I love, and it's worth my time, and where I find growth. But but in a way, I sort of sit there and say, wow, I get paid for doing what I love. And therefore I can afford to do it. And it allows me to do other things with my family and so on and so forth. But yes, there's times when no matter what I'm doing, whether it's in play or other sports or other things in families, there's stuff that's just hard, miserable, and so on and so forth, in the same way there is in work. But I don't know how people get good at something they don't really love. And reading a bunch of books isn't going to help you. It in a way, it takes effort, it takes determination, it takes time for sure. We know that about skill acquisition, but work, I don't know. If I'm working for a company, I choose the company because the work which my life's work can grow there, and I can mutual exploitation by consenting adults. I'll exploit the company because they provide me the means to pursue the things I care about, and they hire me because they want to exploit my ability to contribute to things that they care about that I happen to have, and that's the mutual exploitation by consenting adults kind of model. We both benefit, but financial compensation has never entered the equation. It's there, it's expected, but because nobody's going to want to be taken advantage of on either side of the equation. But that's not why we go. So the question is that what do you care about enough to spend your life doing, or this next section of your life? And I guess I'll go back to another answer to a different answer to a previous question. Is what's my advice to the young designer or profession, in any profession, whether it's in sports or anything, or the arts? My pattern is this: when I find something that I care about and I'm really interested in, I do some homework. And one of the prime pieces of homework is, who is the best person in the world in that field? And how am I going to bug them so much that they'll take me on as an apprentice or a student by making such a nuisance? It's easier to take me on than tell me to keep telling me to go away. And that's a slight exaggeration, but the point is this: life is too short. These things are too important to deal with crummy tools or crummy instruction. You have to go and find out who's the right person. I don't mean the smartest, the richest, the most famous. The person who you can learn the most from. And how can you do that? And for me, early on, before learning to play saxophone, I'd listen to Paul Desmond and Stan Getz and then Wayne Shorter on saxophone. I'm listening to them. I'm studying with them. They don't know me. Never met any of them. But even there, I'm looking for things where I can actually see, because I respect so much what they're doing. But if but in terms of my introduction to computing and interaction, that all came, and instrument design, all of that came because I found people who, or in equestrian stuff, here's this thing. When I wanted to learn how to ride, I had riding lessons for a few months. I saw 3D eventing. I want to do that. I looked up the woman who was a top Canadian in the Los Angeles Olympics, Kelly Plitz, and I just called her up and said, "My name's Bill Buxton. You don't know me. I want to go to the Olympics. I want you to coach me." She said, "Do you have a horse?" "No." "What can you do?" "Almost nothing." She said, "You're crazy." "Why makes you think that?" "Because I really am determined." And she said, "You know what? You have to be crazy to do 3D eventing. You sound like a crazy person. Come on out and I'll see if I think there's any hope, or whether you're a hopeless case." And that led to a 10-year relationship. Now, this is the kind of thing, the same thing to come to the University of Toronto. I saw a piece of computer graphics art in a catalog of the first show of computer art. It's Cybernetic Serendipity. A woman named Yasha Reichart curated it. It was at the Center for Contemporary Art in London. But somebody was trying to do something graphically, a guy named Leslie Mezzi, that I was trying to do musically. This is in 74, 75. I started corresponding him by snail mail. There was no email. And finally he said, "I can't help you anymore. Just come to Toronto. We'll make you an artist in residence. By the way, we don't have an artist in residence program, but we'll give you a key to the lab. It's a computer graphics lab, and so on and so forth. And we'll just figure it out." And so I just went. I moved back to Canada. I had no intentions of doing that. And because I found somebody who resonated, I could learn from, and I went there and reached out. And I think for anyone in the formative stages, but even once you're better known, if you've got a reputation, but in a different field, other people, it's easier. But that's what you have to do. Don't just sit there and wait for it to come. Go where the traffic is, and the chances of getting hit by cars far higher. It'll be random, but you're going to get. You'll find. Go to the places where the people congregate, or whatever. Go to the library. That's choosing your mentor. Is one of the most fundamental things. And by the way, when you get older, and you are one of those people, should you get to that point, it's payback time. By receiving that in your early stages of your career, you take on an implicit responsibility to mentor and help other people down the road. And that's kind of why I'm doing this today. Because it's payback.
Great, I love it. Number 11, if you weren't doing what you do now, what might you be doing? You kind of answered, but.
Take your pick. Yeah, there's another rule I have, and this is in terms of projects. I always have at least 5 things that I want to do more than anything else. I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms. So it's 5 things. I don't care which one, because I care about them all equally. And I know I can't do them all at once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the one which is the easiest to do, the one I'm going to be able to get through and work with the least amount of friction. Not because I'm lazy, because I've already said they're equally important to me as well as to the results. So if I can knock one off, then I can get to the others sooner. So if I want to get as many things done as I can, and by the way, along the process, I might change what are my 5 favorite things to do. And that's within my working professional life and within my personal life as well. So when I moved away from the ocean, my passion for marine zoology, it didn't disappear, but I didn't have the resources to do it. So I switched to something different, distance running. And so it just, you have to, again, that's right back to place, to ubiquity, ubiety as opposed to ubiquity. And so I don't know, because the answer will be different because I might discover something different. And it doesn't mean you're just a gadfly. It means that you're curious. And that's not a bad thing. Never going to apologize for being curious.
Are there things you wouldn't want to do with your career?
I never thought of having a career. I just thought about having a life. And if I'm lucky, I maybe got 20, 25 more years. So yeah, time's shorter. And as I said, my algorithms for or heuristics for deciding what I do next are going to become sharper and more as I go forward. Because I recognize I can't postpone some things for very long. So I have to, priorities change.
How about a favorite word, quote, or sentence?
Say that again.
A favorite word, quote, or sentence?
I'm still sorry. I'm missing.
Sorry, you're choosing a favorite word or a favorite quote or a favorite sentence.
Ah. I can give you a couple. First one is from a historian of technology named Kranzberg, Melvin Kranzberg, who was a historian of technology. And he has 7 laws that the first law is that technology is not good. It is not bad, but nor is it neutral. It will be some combination of the two.
Mm.
And if you use the words good and bad, that means you have some kind of moral compass. Mm-hmm. And with technology, there's probably multiple dimensions of that compass. So it's a bit trickier. But it does say every technological decision is an ethical decision. And the second thing, his second law, and I'll only give you the two, is that invention is the mother of necessity, as opposed to the other way around, how we usually say it. And that means, and that's sort of like a corollary from the first law. Given it's not good, bad, but nor is it neutral, it will be a combination of the two. Having put something out there, you own cleaning up your mess in terms of fixing what you got wrong and also enhancing what you got right. But more people are going to enhance it if you're showing leadership. And so you want to give priority to fixing what you got wrong and figure out. And so to minimize the problem, you got to take a look at that. There's a consequence from this, even that quote, because it says that how I try to manage things myself and with the teams I work with, and this is the classical process or practice of critique as practiced in architecture and good design studios, is you enumerate possibilities to get a number of possible alternatives, meaningfully distinct means to address the problem you're trying to solve. And you enumerate them. But when you add them to the list of things that you are considering, you must give a design rationale. Why that? And why is it meaningfully distinct from the other things? Or is it just the same thing in a wolf in sheep's clothing? But it's just, and so the first part is just the enumeration. And that helps you explore the problem space, the design space. This is the wonderful part of design, where the world's your oyster, you can do anything. There's tons of different ways to do things, and it's just as creative of bringing things out. But then design becomes a really negative thing, because of all of those things, only one's going to emerge. Everything else is thrown away. So it's a really negative process, actually. But you can't eliminate things without giving a reason why.
Mm.
But you, first of all, but on all of those things you have that you've enumerated, you have to say what's the good, the bad, the ugly, and what's neutral, and then compare them. And that helps you. So 2 places for creativity in design: the things you enumerate to consider, and then the closing part is the heuristics, the creativity you bring to the heuristics that you apply in making choice amongst them, and which includes maybe taking pieces of each other and making something new that comes out differently. That's a process that is not, it's well quoted, it's well discussed, it's well covered in the literature, but it's not well present in practice because people appear not to have the time. I think they don't have the time. But that's how you tried to minimize the needs for Kranzberg's second law to be put into play, and try and stack things on the positive side of good versus of the combination, what's the percentage of good and bad in your final decisions. But the final thing I would say is one of 2 of my own, if it's not too egocentric, but one is everything's best for something and worst for something else. And if a responsible design would imply that you need to know the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the dimensions of that good and bad for any particular technology you're using. Well, feeds back into Kranzberg's laws. But the other one is this is a mantra that do not be deluded that the things that we design, be they applications, devices, or services, do not delude ourselves that those things that we create are the outcome or the product of our design efforts. Rather, they're not. Rather, what the output is the experiences that they engender and encourage, the biases that they apply to behaviors in the world when they're in practice. Thurlow, the economist, actually speaks about this in a funny terms, in terms of behavioral economics, as he calls this becoming a bias architect. In some sense, that's what we are. The bias of the path of least resistance is the best way to direct people's behavior by making it simpler and easier, cheaper to be able to achieve a certain end. So you have to design those biases to. So if you don't take into account the experience and you just look at the device and stuff like that and how it's applied, then you have no idea what biases you're doing, or you just leave it for random. And I don't think that's a good way to leave things. But those are 3 lines, one-liners with a bunch of fat, probably overly verbose commentary that I hold fairly close to my heart.
Great. And the flip side, least favorite word, least favorite quote, least favorite sentence.
Oh, that one's easy. Fail early, fail often.
Mm.
That's that makes my blood boil. It's the biggest, simple, and the most cop-out kind of excuse for bad process, bad thinking, and so on and so forth. It's absolute nonsense. It's a terrible negative expression. And this is why words are so important. Just flip it around and say, learn early, learn often. And the reason they're set, and so you can say, well, it's just the same thing the other way around. No, first, one's a positive perspective and the other's negative. No, but it's even more than that. Because failure is just failure. What's learning mean? So when I do an experiment, let's say you're doing an experiment on, let's take a classic example about pointing devices, comparing them in terms of Fitts law and stuff like that. So whatever it is, the first thing about experimental design is you must have, before you do the study, but you design the study accordingly, to test a hypothesis. Here is what I think will happen. Now, how do I test if that's what's actually going to happen? Now, if my hypothesis is proven wrong and it doesn't happen, that is not failure. So when people say science is full of failures, no, science has a hypothesis, and a negative hypothesis, when not achieving the hypothesis not being proven true, basically says, oh, okay, I can just eliminate this part from my search space and I'll go to the next one. I've learned something. It's not a failure. It didn't meet it. It means I asked a good question. I found a knife in which to carve up this problem space to narrow it down, and I can make progress. And the earlier you can do for the fundamental questions, you can actually find a way where you make a hypothesis. That the more effective your design is going to be, because you've got more time on the final level things, because you're not going to make the biggest mistakes. The most expensive ones to correct are the ones that are made earliest in the process. And so get that stuff right when you've got a small team, and you can do it quickly if you've got good process. But the point is, you have to learn. The other place to learn is by going to the literature, because there's a lot of stuff out there, and have people who are good at that. Tom Moran and Stu Card, who are two founders of HCI and are just friends and just huge mentors that I learned a huge amount from, said to me when I was about to do the first experiment, they said, why on God's earth do you want to do an experiment? And I said, well, you guys do experiments. They said, no. We hate doing experiments. There's like sticking hot needles in your eyes. It's like, it's time consuming, it's that. And there's only one reason to do a formal experiment. And that is, if the results you're going to get from it will let you learn something which will improve the quality of your ability to model the behavior so that you can predict behaviors and get to the next level of understanding of what's going on from the human perspective. I'm happy if people want to argue with that, but that lesson that from that conversation, which took place in the parking lot when I was walking into Xerox PARC, when bumped into the two of them, I remember that day, where we were standing, and that's never left me. And I think that the notion of what an experiment is and what a hypothesis is does not mean a Latin squared type experiment. There's many quick ways to do quick and dirty things because you don't always have time. But you have to do your best efforts to learn the most you can within the context of your budget, team sizes, and other pressures. But you have to understand that that's where to spend time, and that's why I think eBay is so neat. I could go on about examples, but I think we've probably hit our time on it.
Great. Okay, 15, you're choosing one word to describe yourself. What word do you choose?
Prospector.
What keeps you up at night?
Prospect for opportunities, prospect for insights, prospect for solutions. And therefore, I try to improve my technique of how to find things.
Great. So again, 16, what keeps you up at night?
Very little. Unless keeping me up at night is when I start something that I'm so engrossed in at noon hour, and I realize I haven't eaten or left working till noon the next day. It doesn't happen that often, but that's just, I forget, I lose sense of time. I'm just so engrossed in whether I'm reading or writing or whatever I'm doing. Um, I sleep well. When I sleep, uh, despite some sleep apnea.
Great. Okay. 17, what's a dream you're chasing?
To ski deep powder in the backcountry with my now 4-year-old granddaughter in a way where she could do that safely. And I can share that with her and her father and me and any other of my grandchildren who care to join us. I want to live that long and be strong enough to be able to do that and be strong enough to climb up whatever slope we're going to be on. And that would feed my soul sufficient to fuel any other ambitions I have in my life. And to still have my wife beside me.
Great. And the last few here, what inspires you?
I am absolutely inspired by excellence in humans. When I see people achieve excellence in what they do, I don't care whether it's playing darts. I thought I hated golf until my wife, who was really interested in golf, I went to a PGA tournament, gave it that to her for a Christmas or a birthday present. And then I realized my concept of what the human is capable of doing in terms of putting together all of these different motor, sensory, cognitive, experiential things to be able to do these feats of putting a little ball in a hole that they can't even see when they're hitting it out of sand bunkers just blows my mind. But it's the same thing in music. When I hear a concert pianist when I see people who have dedicated and committed and can do things, because it's really easy to look around the world and see things which just make you depressed. And the way to keep faith in the human potential is to make sure you expose yourself to the other side and have that be enough to help drive you forward. Well, if they can do it, maybe so can I. At least try. And when you get knocked down, which we all do, and you want to quit, have people around you, your family and other friends, and that'll support you, but also at the same time, other people who have been through the same thing, which will help inspire you to keep going, and that you're on the right path. And maybe you're not, so you can find that out as well. But that's okay too. That's just learning, and learn early. The more things you try. When there was a time in SIGCHI which is the main academic conference in our field, on the 20th anniversary, they had a trivia contest. And one of the questions in the trivia contest was who had written the most papers in SIGCHI in the first 20 years. And if memory serves me correctly, one of my students came up and said, "Hey, did you know that was you?" And I said, "No, but what's hidden in that is the fact I probably have had the most papers rejected as well. Mm. So my percentage is probably the same as everybody else's." Mm. The question was it's how hard were you going to work? And by the way, almost none of those papers are written by me alone. So I'm a co-author, not just the sole author, and sometimes I'm the last author. But that's the point, is that you yeah, there's opportunities, there's luck, but it's choice of partners and who you work with and how you work. And sometimes it's better to go figure out new ways to approach something than to just start off doing the project. To have the stuff up front.
Great. And 19, any advice you'd like to share?
Well, I'll give you another quote in a way that I think that I'm extremely concerned about where the world is today, and largely because of the tools and technologies that we, and certainly I've been involved with, and it's really easy to get discouraged. And I guess I have to revert to Margaret Mead, who said, never doubt that a small group of determined individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And I say that in light of and in full recognition of what has become, and through that TV series, Silicon Valley, has one of the largest cliches in digital tech in Silicon Valley, and that is, we're going to make the best compression algorithm in the world, best compression that's ever been, and change the world and make the world a better place. Everybody gives lip service to, we're going to make the world a better place. We're going to help humanity. We're going to help improve things. It's a cliche. It's BS. It's marketing. It's publicity, unless it's backed up with solid proof in terms of your process, your values, and execution, and what you're working on, and being able to articulate how and what you're not doing. And it's a really hard thing to do under the pressures of meeting this supposed reality of you don't work for the product, the customer, you work for the shareholders. And the shareholders, if they don't share your values. So in that regard, a book that I would highly recommend, this is another example of one of my passions about mountaineering, having a huge influence on how I approach my work, is like this guy who founded Patagonia, Yvon Chouinard, who wrote a book, Let My People Go Surfing, the Diary of a Reluctant Businessman. Take a look at just even the first edition of that book. And I think that's one of the best design textbooks I've ever seen, because it speaks about design at all the different levels, and in particular the ethics and why he keeps the company public, and how he started the 1% for the earth type of mechanism. The point is, he's a businessman. He's got a very successful business, and it's founded on a very different model than most businesses. And I think that there are examples out there that show that there's other ways to do things. I think that Yvon's somebody I respect hugely. Oh, by the way, my initial respect was as a mountaineer, because he was just hardcore in Yosemite and stuff like that. His innovations and designs transformed ice climbing, so which I appreciate, because I make use of his tools. But the main thing is search for other ways of doing things, and by being different, you'll stand out. Which, if you're right, you'll gain attention, and if you've got attention, you can gain momentum, and then you can be a leader. But don't just be different for difference's sake. You have to be able to rationalize it meaningfully, why this is the right way, and what's different about it, and what's significant about it, before you launch that, before you start Patagonia or a similar kind of company.
Great. And finally, number 20, how can our listeners keep tabs on you, and what's our call to action today?
Well, I probably have the worst webpage, so I'll lose all credibility. but there's just billbuxton.com. The best I can say is that almost everything I've ever published is there freely available online on that site. And so are annotated bibliographies of my library on the history of North America, the history of Central Asia and mountaineering, the history, and also my design library. And basically all the essays and so on. So it's there. There's no paywall. It's there.
Awesome.
And that's how to, and social media, I have largely withdrawn from Twitter or X because I'm guard my time, and the return on time invested has diminished greatly, and you have to wade through so much stuff that I tend not to. And the same reason I'm on LinkedIn, but again, I guess maybe I'm just showing my age. Email is my favorite means of communicating with people that I interact with. And I don't jump around. I don't care how many followers I have. I'm happy to have followers, but I'll put stuff out. I'm no longer in the PR game to try and promote myself. I'm easy to find. If you want to find me, I'm findable.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for this gem. Beautiful episode. Very excited to put it out there. Yeah, thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks and good luck. Bye-bye.